Hello everybody, and welcome to our Future Structures panel. Thank you Minister Brooks for coming today, and thank you for popping in. It's so great to see you. My name is Gavin Summers. I'm ACMI's Director of First Nations Equity and Social Policy, and I'm a proud butcher, Gubby man from my mobber from the central coast of Queensland. And I also want to pay my respects to the traditional owners of the lands we're meeting on today, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and pay my respects to elders past and present, and of course elders in the room. And thank you for Uncle Tony for the beautiful welcome to country this morning. We're going to be talking about future structures and just talking about various aspects and concepts and challenges of future governance structures. So I'd like to invite our panel members up to the stage, and I'll briefly introduce each of them and give them a chance to also introduce themselves. So just give us a moment. We'll transfer over to here. So I'll briefly introduce who we have over here. We have Lucy Sollitt from Future Everything, who's made it the trip all the way from the UK. We have Bonnie Shaw with the Municipal Association of Victoria. We have Professor Dan Hill from the University of Melbourne. Natalie Turmine from Service and Creative Skills Australia, and Dr. Christen Cornell from Creative Australia. And each of our panellists brings a diverse range of knowledge, experience and expertise to this conversation. We're going to cover a lot actually. But before we get into the discussion, I thought it would be really nice for each of our panel members just to give themselves a brief introduction and tell us a bit about their relevant background and work in this space. So I'm going to throw to you first, Lucy.
Okay, thank you. So I've come over from the UK. I've worked in the UK cultural sector for around 20 years or so. And during that time, I've played many different roles, from curator to artist mentor, researcher, writer, as well as working across funding and policy. So I've always kind of been interested in the edges of visual arts practice, and that convergence of art and technology has been a key part of that. And in June last year, I joined Future Everything as their creative director. Future Everything is a cultural organisation which I think shares some similarities with ACMI, although it's much, much smaller, but definitely concerned with the what's next questions, and really looking and exploring that the kind of creative and critical implications of technology for society. And it's our 30th year anniversary this year, so it's a bit of a milestone. Future Everything started as a festival, was kind of a leading ideas festival, and then moved to become a kind of year-round, having a year-round program, which includes kind of artist commissions, research and ideas generation, cross-sectoral collaborations, and also artist skills development. And we're currently in the process of bringing nature onto our board. We're the first cultural organisation in the UK to do this, and I think that's a key reason for ACMI inviting me here today, and I'm really grateful to be here to learn from you all and to get a taste of cultural life in Melbourne. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Dan, we'll just go down the line.
Okay, are we going to use the slides or not? Just a technical question.
Oh,
if not, it doesn't matter.
Oh no,
I'll just busk it.
Yeah.
Thanks. Well, you've already heard from me, so I'll keep this very short. But I was part of one of the first Future Everythings actually, so it's very nice to connect the dots here. I lived in Manchester for a few years, working in that sector as well, in the northern quarter there of the city. So my background is cities and culture in particular, and as you probably heard from the introduction I gave previously for Deb's talk, it's wheeling around these connected areas of technology, infrastructure of everyday life, cultural and social institutions, and libraries, museums, galleries, festivals, etc., and the way that they're at the core of neighbourhoods and communities and so on, and trying to make a case for that, often in the context of policy making or strategy or words to that effect. Strategy is a horrible word, but effectively the decision making part of stuff. And I've done that half the time in the private sector, I suppose, working as a designer, and then half the time in government, the Finnish government, the Swedish government, bits of the UK and other things. So yeah, that's me.
Right, thank you.
Hi, I'm Bonnie Shaw. I am originally trained as a landscape architect and urban designer and started my career kind of looking at landscape ecologies and community co-design work. And then I created a game that became a bit of a global hit, played by tens of thousands of people in hundreds of cities around the world. And I got sucked into a motley crew of street gamers in the UK, experimenting with interactive theatre and geolocative and interactive technologies, which is where I intersected with Lucy's organisation as well. And that spun me out into a completely different type of career where I have worked across a whole range of different industries and countries in innovation labs, in credit card banks, in federal governments, and in non-profits, doing work around large-scale community engagement and capability development. Now I am the Chief Innovator in Residence at the Municipal Association of Victoria, where I have the pleasure and privilege of leading the MAV Lab, which is a new innovation lab that we launched last year, serving all 79 councils in Victoria, where we're focusing on work looking at building capability and strategic foresight and innovation practice in councils. We're looking at work related to active democracy and engagement. We're looking at risk infrastructure and resilience and service innovation and efficiency with a lens of advanced technologies. Really exciting work. I know there are a few people in the audience that I asked to give a shout out if they're here. Hello. I do that for half my week. The other half of my week, I've recently been appointed as a professor of practice at RMIT University in the School of Design and Social Context, where I'm leading a program of work and research looking at the impacts of stress on our cognition and behaviour as it specifically relates to innovation and a capacity to engage with the complex challenges that we need to address now and into the future.
Thank you.
That is a hard act to follow. So I'm Christen. I work at Creative Australia, and I made my way there through work in the arts and academia, but I'm not really here to talk about my personal practice or research today. I'm here because I work in the research team at Creative Australia, and we've just done a really huge piece of work with Service and Creative Skills Australia, which you'll hear about in a sec, which is called the Creative Workforce Scoping Study. This was an action in the National Cultural Policy, Revive, and it's looking at workforce issues across creative industries defined as 6 sectors, so music, performing arts as separate from music, literature and publishing, visual arts, games, digital games, and screen. So really historic in scope, but also the kind of groundbreaking element in that scope is we're looking at the creative workforce, but also all of the support workers. We're looking at technical and production roles, as well as marketing and communications, finance and accounting, and leadership roles. So that is going to be out in about a month, I think. And I guess as a piece of work, it's really exciting to us at Creative Australia, and we think for the arts, because it's an example of cross-portfolio collaboration, which came out of Revive, in this case with the Department of Employment and Workplace Relations. And it's a huge investment from that department in the arts sector and in recognising a lot of the structural issues that exist within the creative workforce that I think a lot of us have known about for a really long time. So it's also very structural as a piece of work, looking at everything in that way and the complexities that exist. As a lot of us know, creative workers work across a lot of those 6 sectors and beyond. And the working beyond is something I'd really love to talk about today, to follow on from that fantastic keynote.
Thanks, Christen. Good morning. It is still morning, isn't it? Yes, it is. Morning, everybody. My name is Natalie Turmine, and as mentioned, I'm the CEO of Service and Creative Skills Australia, or SACSA, as we like to call it. I have 30 years' experience in the workforce development, training industries across a range of industries. But SACSA in particular, we're one of the new 10 jobs and skills councils. We are federally funded, and our key remit is to undertake workforce planning, training product development, so that the vet sector is training the right things at the right time in the right places, and also stewardship on behalf of the industry. We look after 5 industries, arts being one of them. We also look after tourism, hospitality, personal services, and retail as well too. So all service and creative based, hence the name of our company. But I've also got over 12 years experience on boards, and I'm also a chair of a board. So for me, governance is an absolutely critical component of running successful organisations, because without good governance you can't have a good organisation. So keen to share a little bit of my experience, not from only from a workforce development point of view, but also from a governance point of view. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. And I was very fortunate to be able to catch up with each of you, or most of you, last week and this week to talk about this topic. So a great breadth of experience. I'm really looking forward to chatting. Now, this morning we have all seen we've got some questions that we're going to run through and discuss. But we are going to keep this fairly conversational, so I'll be just passing questions to the panel. But of course, we're going to be inviting our audience members, you to submit questions on Slido, so you can just scan the QR code, which will be on the screen at some point, and submit your questions, which we'll monitor throughout the session. But to ensure we get through as many of our topics as we can, we will throw to the questions at the end of our chat. So let's get into it, shall we? So in framing the topic this morning, we were talking the other day about how might we proactively redesign the governance structures of institutions to enable them to succeed in the future. You would have seen in the topic for today, in the topics, we're going to be discussing how nature is finding a seat on boards, how innovation is being incubated inside local governments. We'll be discussing how what skills we need from individuals for boards to succeed in the future, and also exploring how we might actively design or decentralise organisations in the future for them to succeed. The first topic we're going to touch on, or we're going to get into, is integrating environmental sustainability in governance. And there should be a quote on the screen. I thought this quote beautifully underscores the evolving role of sustainability in governance and encourages a shift from minimising harm to actively contributing to positive change. And from my understanding, by appointing a representative, we are essentially giving nature a voice in the boardroom. But how does this work in practice? I have to say this was a fairly new concept to me until just recently. So I have learnt a lot in the last couple of days. So Lucy, I'd like to throw to you first to explain a little bit about what we talked about yesterday, and what does this mean in practice to have nature on the board, and where did this idea come from?
Yeah, so I mean we're in the process of figuring it out to some degree, but there are some standards that are being set in this area. So actually, there's the organisation it's a company called Faith in Nature. Was the first organisation to put nature on the board, and they did that in 2022. And they worked with Lawyers for Nature, which is a collective of kind of legal activists in the UK, and also Earth Law Centre, to kind of devise this model for what that could look like, and how does that work legally, on constitutions and so on, what are the protocols you need around it. And the standard kind of, what does it actually look like in practice, that's been kind of set by that example, is to go with a proxy, which they describe as a kind of nature guardian. But this proxy is actually a legal director with voting power. There are other models as well. You could kind of have a kind of lower intensity in a way of engagement, and have like nature being a witness or observer. But around, so there's actually around the proxy, there are various different protocols that are embedded. In Faith in Nature, for example, the proxy has a budget to spend and a kind of endless network of advisors that they can pull on. And at Future Everything, we're taking inspiration from this model, but also really trying to take it to the next stage as well. And so we've been working with Lawyers for Nature, who are giving us kind of pro bono support because they're interested in how we can evolve the model as well from this, from our kind of the way we go about things in culture, really. And we've also convened a working group. And the working group is made up of multi-species justice experts, environmental justice experts, decolonial theorists, technologists, artists. There's also in Ottawa Anishinaabe person who is there as well, and bringing that Indigenous perspective to our considerations as well. And that's been really pivotal, having that working group. And at the moment, I'm having kind of monthly meetings with them to really, and taking questions and ideas and research to them and getting their feedback and discussing how we might evolve this. But our intention at Future Everything is to have a proxy in place, and that will be legally reflected in our constitution. There will be a director of the organisation. They might have power to veto, they might have more voting rights than others, but also to develop proxy protocols and start to think about behavioural change within the organisation, which works at every level. Because actually a lot of our decision making doesn't just take place in the board. We're a small arts organisation, so the exec and team play a really key role. But we would like to get to a point where we're really thinking about participation and direct participation rather than a kind of representation model. But that's a big ask, and what does it look like? And that's some of the things we're exploring with the working group. So I hope that gives some background to the approach we're taking.
That's wonderful. As I said, it was a very new concept to me, and I'm very interested to hear from the other panel members if they have had any experience with having nature having a seat on the board. Yeah?
Yeah, I can share.
Please.
I think it's important for us to also look potentially at what other industries are doing that have already, had this debacle of how do we manage this. And as I mentioned earlier, so one of my other roles that I have is I'm chair of the board of Australian Racing Drivers Club, and we actually run Sydney Motorsports Park in Western Sydney, which is Australia's premier racetrack. We have over 1,000 events there a year, and as you can imagine, there's a lot of petrol guzzling motors running around that every day. So we sort of looked at it many, many years ago and said, we can't keep doing this, and for many reasons. So we actually looked at how do we bring nature on the board as far as a strategic priority for our organisation. So being that we're a club, that's one thing we do, but we also are running a New South Wales government facility as well too. So we were looking at it sort of saying, well, what's our role as directors, not only for our members and for our facility, but for the environment. So we haven't utilised a proxy situation, more of an upskilling situation, first of all with our board. And we see that we have a key role here to play as leaders. This is something we don't have to do. This is something we want to do. So we we agreed as a board that this was something that we were going to make at the forefront of all our decision making. So it's actually embedded into our decision making as a board, not just a corporate responsibility. So we have one of our key strategic pillars in our strategic plan is sustainability focused. We also, our CEO has KPIs. But we're also doing a lot of marketing around it as well too. So we want to make the invisible visible. We think we have a really key role here to actually change culture of the motorsports industry. If they can see us doing it and doing it well and economically, that flow-on effect then will flow through. So I think it's critical for boards to be starting to look at it now from a point of view of this is something that, we want to be doing as opposed to have to.
That's fantastic. I think, Dan, you had some examples as well. Work.
Yes and no. Not on the board per se, but I think it's so interesting, and I'd love to hear more technically how that would work. But the general idea is so profound, as in how maybe we think about it from a design point of view, is how we get used to living alongside other intelligences, recognizing that there are natural intelligences and human intelligences are part of natural intelligences, but we can't speak directly to a tree, let me put it that way. Well, I can't anyway. But we have a relational kinship, reciprocal understanding of it, as we're both part of nature. So it's something that we can't talk to directly, and yet we clearly have a series of interactions with it, and we need to shift those from negative and extractive clearly to more reciprocal and so on. And which makes me think, again, it's a bit, maybe this is setting up the next question for you, Gavin, but around artificial intelligences as well. We also need to understand how we're going to be living alongside those things. And so then they are, in a sense, almost things. There are other intelligences, and again, we can't speak to them anymore, even though we wrote the original code for it. We can't now read the code that is producing AI. It's beyond our cognitive capability. So we'll be in a world with multiple different types of intelligence, and finding a way of harmoniously doing that, I think, was really profoundly interesting. And then maybe to bring that down to the ground, we did a project last year with Fisherman's Bend, actually, which many of you will know in Melbourne, Fisherman's Bend Innovation, which was more than human urban design, where we looked at how would you do the urban design for Fisherman's Bend, which is a big urban development project, from a more than human perspective. So how do you understand what that place is like from a bee's perspective or a bird's perspective? And of course we can't understand that. There's a very famous paper from the 70s about what is it like to think like a bat, and we can't. We're not a bat. But there's lots of ways that we can simulate that and understand it. And of course, working with ecologists and others, you can understand from a scientific perspective, but then to make that experiential, we can then use augmented reality, virtual reality simulations, and look at light signals and auditory signals. And actually what you end up doing is then designing a landscape based around where the sound and the light might be more or less affecting. So the complete opposite of how urban design happens, usually, in a way. Which for me then finally was connecting to then the work we were doing in Sweden and thinking about the streets. Sorry to mention Sweden again. The retrofitting all of the streets in the country to enable them to be biodiverse and healthy environments. So streets are public space, and therefore they're also natural space because we are nature. And so giving people a chance to say, what would you like your street to be? Blank piece of paper. They often got rid of car parking spaces and started putting in things like trees and so on. We realized that we don't actually do that. I'm sure none of you have actually been asked, what would you actually like your street to be? Blank piece of paper right outside your front door, even though it belongs to you. And when we are given the choice, we tend to make more nature positive, sustainable decisions, it turns out, given the choice. And so we work with the artist and musician, again, second mention of him, won't be the last, Brian Eno. Because with streets in mind, it's so dominated by transport planners and transport planning mentality, which is a very kind of hard edge of the engineering spectrum, not the nice Deb Chatra end of it, but the very hard metrics end of it. And so to bring an artist musician into the room and say, you can write some design principles for urban design and street design, which is what he did. And the first one was, and this comes to the quote you had previously, which is, how do we design for things that are uncertain? He said, think like a gardener, not like an architect. Design beginnings, not endings. And so to get something going as if it's a garden was a much better metaphor of how a street might unfold. Because any of you know that's tried to ever make a garden, know you might have an idea for it, a plan for it, but nature's going to happen. And so what do? You go out there every day and you till it and you water it and you prune it and you put your fingers in the soil and so on, and you engage with it directly. And that way you can kind of wiggle towards a harmonious future, buffeted by uncertainty. But it's this active engagement with it, which is the exact opposite, again, of how most urban design happens, most urban policy making happens. And so we wanted to foreground the idea of natural systems in a number of ways, but also, as in making space for them so that they're part of the urban environment, genuinely. But then the second thing is, so what's that work look like? And it looks more like gardening than traditional policy making or traditional governance structures.
Yeah, that's amazing. Have others had experience with having nature on the boards, or can you see it in your organisations in these kinds of ways?
I haven't had experience with nature on the board, apart from Sim and Anne, who lead Faith in Nature, are very good friends of mine, and I sort of got a background view of that process, which was fascinating, sort of watching them negotiate that for the first time. What it brings to mind for me is really kind of authentic co-design work, where you're bringing in a diversity of opinions and experiences into a design and decision-making process and giving value to that diversity of perspective, and finding the tensions and trade-offs within those often competing views. I think a lot of the time in my work, I'm acting as a bit of a bridge between kind of new ideas that are a little bit amorphous and unformed, the beginnings, and the kind of harder structured ways of doing things now. And finding pathways that look familiar from here to there are really helpful for people that aren't as comfortable kind of stepping into that less formed picture. And so a co-design process, kind of rich, authentic community engagement are processes that are pretty well understood in a lot of organisations now. And maybe there's some kind of very clear parallels in existing structures that can be kind of adapted within that kind of framework, so that it's not something kind of scary and foreign and completely new that sounds really wacky.
Just to add to that, I think we're interested in kind of doing the weird and wacky and the more kind of co-design and things like that. We're waiting to hear whether we've got funding for a researcher who's working with multi-species co-design to kind of help support aspects of our process with this, but and also just picking up what you were saying, Dan, like going to the more like speculative, experimental side of things as well. This is fundamentally about kind of learning to re-embed the human within the more than human world, because, you know, speaking from a British perspective, you know, that's very much a fractured relationship. And so behavioural change around, you know, how do we attune, which I think you were touching on actually in terms of the role of technology can play potentially in that, but also, you know, I'd think old and new technologies. And also, that question of like, how do you create that porosity, knowing in a co-design kind of way that will also open us up to kind of conflict. We're not always going to be in agreement with nature. What it says.
Absolutely. Christen, did you have something you
made a good point there around the thinking as well too, because, you know, if you look at all the governance institutes and AICD and that, what the message they're really trying to get out at the moment is diversity on boards also means diversity of thinking. And so there's a real role here for creatives on boards, because a lot of this nature stuff does involve creative thinking and problem solving. So I think part of that diversity the boards need to be looking at is bringing in creatives so that they can actually assist with some of those big, hairy, audacious problems that we've got to tackle.
I forgot my point that I had written down when you were speaking as well. I love, like, I assume I'm probably grossly generalising, but I assume your organisation is relatively kind of conservative for a motorsports.
They love big, loud engines.
And so, like, that's a really bold move for them to move in the direction you described. But I love that you're using kind of existing infrastructure within your decision-making process. So the chairman of the board has KPIs, which is such a powerful tool within a kind of traditionally structured organisation. To give people KPIs is a really powerful forcing mechanism, which is a great, again, adaptation of an old way of working.
It's what gets measured gets managed. So
it's awesome.
But it has been, and it is a culture change for, you know, to take the board on that journey as well too, but for us to then realise we need now to bring that entire community on a journey with us as well.
I imagine it's a bigger culture change for some more than others, really, if you think about it.
The great thing is, and this is, you know, once again where creatives can play a really important role on these boards, is around storytelling. And, you know, if anyone's seen that movie Ford versus Ferrari, you know, the reason Ford got into the car racing was, you know, to be seen and make it all sexy and exciting so people will buy their cars. That's what we're trying to do with sustainability and nature, is to actually make it exciting and sexy and exciting to a culture that hasn't ever thought about it or has actually been quite, you know, vocal in repelling it. So I think that storytelling, and as I mentioned before about making the invisible visible, it's really crucial that we get that story out there to the public.
Exactly. Christen, did you have something you wanted to throw in?
I have no experience with having nature on the board, but certainly Creative Australia has a lot of experience with the idea of creative thinking being necessary for adaptation to climate change, for example, as one of the huge adaptations that we're going through, as well as technological change. Creative recovery is a whole kind of area of practice within the arts. And Creative Australia recently supported a new kind of consortium of people who work in the climate space to come together, not only to think about how the arts sector needs to address its own carbon footprint and some of its practices, but also to use that resource, that incredible resource of being able to reimagine a relationship to place, be able to reimagine one's identity in relationship to a changing place, perhaps after a fire has ripped through, that this is part of the huge kind of value proposition of what the arts can do. So that, yes, very familiar, and I love Brian Eno, and I'm happy to keep quoting him as well, with, like how the arts is this opportunity to rehearse particular ideas in a comfortable or a safe way, or if you feel uncomfortable, it's okay because you can turn it off or leave the room. But then I also thought I'd contribute some data because it's really interesting through our scoping. I've described the scoping study, right? And that's really important because it's looking at the creative workforce and it's also looking at the support workers. The definition is very kind of arts focused. There are other definitions of the creative workforce which are broader and include things like design and advertising and architecture. And some may know this Trident method, which was kind of popularised by Stuart Cunningham. And it's where you can say, okay, let's look at census data, which is already kind of a problem in the arts because it's only people's primary income, right? That cuts out a lot of people who are still actively involved. But if we look at the census data, we go, okay, these are the creative workers who are working in the creative industries. These are the support workers who are working in the creative industries, the human resources people, the accountants. And then they talk about embedded workers, and these are the creative workers who are working in other industries. And so, yeah, they're called embedded creatives, and that is higher than the group of, the number there is higher than the group of creatives who are working in the creative industries. And they can break it down by industry, and there are figures for those creatives who are working in things like mining or in transport or in kind of primary industries and engineering. So obviously I was thinking about this morning. It's also the area of the most growth if you look at those three kinds of groups. So I guess it's also an argument for investing in that core infrastructure, which is the arts and the creative kind of education, as well as the support workers who can do that work, because there are these tremendous kind of transferable skills and flow-on effects that we know are kind of connected to this ability to think imaginatively.
Can I jump on that?
Yes, please.
Just in the spirit of getting a conversation rolling, just to push back gently and recognise that, I mean, it comes a bit from Justin O'Connor, who I mentioned earlier, who's speaking here on Saturday. His recent book, Culture is Not an Industry, and just trying to be as clear as possible about the danger of using econometrics to describe bits of culture that are not the part of the industry, whilst recognising parts of culture absolutely are an industry. And it's always caught on this issue, as in Sony Music is a huge company. The Sony PlayStation is a very successful product. They're part of culture. So those bits are part of an industry, clearly. There is GRP and other things associated with those things and so on. But then culture in the broader sense of culture of everyday life, or let's say the cultural influence inside policy making and so on, it's not an industry in the same way. And the UK has lots to answer for here, as usual. The creative industry in the mid-90s onwards has tried to make the case for the counting of the sector, and classically really hard to do because of exactly what you just described. And it's very dangerous, actually, because it's led to a diminution of the sector in the UK and arguably in Australia, because we've tried to make a case for it as an industry, and then it just does not stack up. And the UK doesn't stack up next to the City of London, which drives the whole UK economy, unfortunately. Here it doesn't stack up next to mining and other things. Well, basically mining. So there are no other things. So it actually puts us on a sticky wicket, really, where we're trying to do the right thing by making the case for it, but we're using, in a way, the tools of another way of thinking to try and describe something which is beyond that remit. I'm sure I know you know this.
I have pushback.
No, this is good. I knew it'd be a good conversation. So I just want to, try to understand, almost like in a Venn diagram-y kind of way. There is definitely a bit which is the industry, like I said, like music companies and others. But as Ornette Coleman once said to Steve Reich, that the music industry is not the music world. They're two different things, or rather, there's an overlap. The music world is much, 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 much bigger, and it includes everybody who's ever sung and played and thought about it. So anyway, I think it's incredibly important to clearly look at those things, because they do drive the way we then think about skills and jobs and training. But I know from someone working in the education sector, that can then be a very narrow kind of pipeline where you'll sort of be creating job-ready graduates to go straight into a sector. In reality, the impact of design, say, or architecture, could be far more profound if it was unleashed a little bit from a purely economic outcome. Anyway.
I would say we use particular data sets for particular contexts. And when we need to count this workforce, the census work is one of the data sets that we go to. In the study, actually, we say this is one way to do it, but then we go to the artist survey, which is done by Professor David Throsby at Macquarie University. And it's always been done as a complement to the census, because we understand that the census has these limitations. Also, the codes under which it kind of collects that data are not fit for purpose for our sector. So we have this other piece of work, which we call the artist survey. What's the proper term? The kind of economic study of professional and practicing artists. And the word practicing is really important in there, because it acknowledges that if you are recognised by your peers, you are a practicing artist, and it has a kind of eligibility criteria for that recognition. And through that work, David Throsby, in discussion with us, asked the questions that are appropriate for that workforce. We ask about community arts and cultural development. That's not covered, that's not tracked in the census. We have other work where we look at the social impacts of arts and culture in community. We do a national arts participation survey, and we ask particular questions about participation in one's own culture, where we start to step away from a more kind of professional definition of arts practice and more about cultural engagement, perhaps for migrant groups, certainly for Indigenous people. And then David Throsby also does a separate survey, knowing that this big artist survey one is only metropolitan and regional areas. He goes to remote First Nations communities and asks a completely different set of questions and finds that a really high percentage of people identify as a cultural practitioner. So it has to be appropriate for the context, I agree. And when somebody asks us, look at census and tell us what the workforce is, we can say, all right, we use this method really carefully with a lot of caveats, and this is what we can give you alongside all these other data sets.
Can I pick up on something that is maybe relates to this kind of tension, and it's around funding. So with relating this back to nature on the board and some of the thinking we're doing around that, and if we are thinking about attuning, then one of the ways we might kind of shift working, for example, as an organisation, is with seasonality. If we work with seasonality and we kind of were saying, even going into hibernation in the winter months, for the UK, obviously, then, that would be a real problem for funders. And because, and also for us as an organisation, because we need to fundraise for everything we do. We have no core funding. So we have to work at speed. And that's like in direct conflict with trying to, experiment with other ways of doing things. And when we were doing we did a kind of mapping process, like where are decisions being made, and where is power held within the organisation plus externally? What can we influence, and what external influences are there on us? And funders were like one of our biggest external influences, along with audiences and artists and everything like that. But funders was pretty big, and I think that's like a tension that connects to some of the points you were raising there about like, how do you kind of make these kind of transformational changes when the funding structures we're working with are not set up for it.
If you have AI on the board, that can be putting in the funding applications for you, while the natural side of the board is having a kit. So it'll be all right.
Keep it going. Keep it rolling. It's a great idea.
Great idea.
The Arts Council will love that.
I know.
I think to Christen's point as well too, and we produced separate to the workforce scoping study. Last year was our first arts workforce plan, and we have another one coming out in March, which is going to sort of detail a lot of the activities that we're going to do now with the sector and the education system and different states and territories and that around growing the workforce. Because one of the greatest things we saw, we do have attraction and retention issues in the sector. Attraction, a lot of it coming down to perception of the industry, and a lot of that's actually coming from schools and parents at the moment, where they're not seeing it as a viable career option or a real job. It's a dream job, or there's low hours, low pay, unstable work, things like that. So we're looking at some issues around that attraction, but it's retention as well. And what we're seeing, and particularly after COVID, because as we know, the arts industry was just decimated during that time and highly affected, that we lost a lot of leaders. and those leaders haven't come back. So we've now got this skill shortage across majority of the arts sector in leadership skills. So if we're going to be looking at good governance and leading these organisations to the next level, we need to be looking at supporting that workforce then, and then actually developing leadership skills as well too.
Yeah, absolutely. And we're going to dive a little bit deeper into that a bit further in too. I just wanted to circle back to something which I think you might have covered quickly before we go to another topic. Is, you know, I'm on the board of on an Indigenous theatre company, and I've been in other committees and other boards over many years. And I was sitting here thinking, as you're all talking, how could we future-proof these really good intentions to have nature on the board? If I'm running a theatre, like running a company, running a board now, how can I ensure that future boards and the organisation in future will maintain that commitment? I'd love to hear some suggestions.
It's got to be in the strategic plan.
Yeah.
Simply put, it's got to be in the strategic plan.
Yeah.
And as I was saying to Bonnie earlier, you know, if it's what gets measured gets managed. You know, so if you've got an agreed focus, agreed KPIs, and then it's being reported on at every board meeting, it's top of the pops as far as your attention on it. So that would be my advice: is build it into your organisational strategic plan.
Yeah. Lucy?
For us, we'll be changing our constitution legally to put nature in as a director. I hope Future Everything won't mind me saying that when I look back at our constitutional documents, they haven't been changed since 2004. So I don't think that gives me some hope that they might not be messed with again. Although actually we want to treat our constitution as a kind of live, evolving thing. So therefore someone could come along and, you know, change it. But then another kind of dimension of this is around transparency. So a big debate, which I won't go into now because it's slightly tangential, but with what we're doing is do we want to even use a rights model? You know, it's embedded in a Western legal framework. There are loads of issues with that. But one of the useful things with it, and this is the conclusion that our working group came to as well, is around accountability. And with that, transparency is a kind of key question. So in essence, if we are kind of reporting out to our communities of interest about what we're doing and to our funders and things like that, then we will also have to explain why we changed our mind or something like that. So that's another aspect of it. And you can look at the transparency in different ways, like to what degree should every conversation that we have at the board be transparently open and published online. So that's another way, I think, of kind of ensuring that kind of legacy along with behavioural change activities and awareness raising. We want to gradually influence the partners that we work with in a collaborative way.
That would
as
be
well.
ideal.
So that's also maybe legacy, because you can put that into kind of partnership agreements and the way we work with artists. And
that's a wonderful
I
idea.
would build on that and say and add building social license. So if you're moving into something that's a significant change from what people are used to, depending on the type of organisation you are, if you're a public institution, you need to have social license to maintain that change and prove that the changes that you've made are adding value. And so finding ways to educate and inform your constituents, your kind of community, on the value that this change has delivered, so that you can continue to do it, so that you have the license to continue to do it and seek support and investment. And that can be very difficult with big changes.
Yeah, exactly. We talked a little bit about, I think with some of you, I talked a little bit about this the other day, about measuring the success of having nature. We mentioned KPIs. So, I mean, it's absolutely essential to make sure we do that.
We, at the moment, at Sydney Motorsports Park, we are the number one track in Australia on the Sustainability Circuits Index, which is a global measure. But we've given the CEO a target of improving that and upping the number of trophies he's got and things like that. So it's some of our goals are big, hairy, and audacious, and I think you need to have some of those BHAGs occasionally, but ultimately they're about realistic, achievable goals, because that's how we'll make a difference, not just dreaming about it, but putting the play and a budget.
I really like that one of your your KPIs is more trophies.
Yeah.
Exactly. As we unpack this, we could talk a whole session about this topic, and I do want to move on to some other topics. Dan, did you want to?
Well, it's just there's something. It's a really interesting question because it brings up this question of time frames, and from a design point of view, you're usually thinking in terms of fast layers of change and slow layers of change. Like a building like this should last for, I don't know, Seb, wherever you are, but let's say 100 years, 140, something like that. It's a meaningful civic investment. The Wi-Fi system should not last for 140 years. So, that updates probably every week, actually, software-wise, but certainly every 5 years or something. So you've got these kind of different speeds of things that move through, and things like strategic plans are fast layers, really. They're really, because they might change every 5 years or 4 years. Those are short-term things. They're super important because they affect short-term actions, but I'm wondering if there's a way you can think about, with the theatre company in mind, there are things that you can do that bind you to a long-term rhythm or cadence or something. So, classically, making a building for the theatre company would force a certain kind of long-term thinking, long-term investment, maintenance. How do we embody that? But then it also stands for something meaningful as a civic gesture to people around it. And so it plays out, it sort of pays off, if you like, over 100 years or so easily. There's a lovely artwork by Katie Patterson. I was just looking it up on my phone. I wasn't doing my email. It planted, a forest has been planted outside Oslo, where there's a city forest anyway, and it's linked to a library. And every year a tree in that forest produces the paper for a book which goes into the library. So, there's somebody's commissioned them to write the book. So Margaret Atwood's written a book, David Mitchell, Han Kang and others, Carla Vinoscott have all written a book, which is then made from the forest trees that are planted, and then over time those trees themselves also make a new room in the library to hold the books. Oh, wow. So ultimately this forest, which is again, hundreds of years, because trees last longer than people, force us to work at their speed really. But it also comes back to meaningful kind of interventions every day, every month, every week. So I love your question because it immediately started making me think of this kind of short, fast, medium, kind of slow, long-term thinking and how you organize governance of an organization over those different speeds.
And some organizations move a lot slower than others. And in my on my board we have what's called we had elders in residence, and so we have 2 Indigenous elders who continually advise the board throughout the year. And so we are obliged culturally to not move any faster than the pace that they set. Yeah. So it's very different. I've been on mainstream boards, and it's very different from being on an Indigenous board to a mainstream board in my experience. Yeah. Both amazing experiences, and learned a lot. But having that pace, you're exactly right. The pace is very important. Yeah. I'd love to shift slightly to another topic that we had talked about, which is fostering innovation in local governments. So I thought these 2 quotes were really relevant to viewing change really positively and to leverage positive change in governance practices. And Bonnie, you provided one of these quotes for me. Do you want to comment on?
I provided both of these.
You did.
Sorry. I'll do the second one first, which is innovation for the public good. Pro bono publico, which is for the public good, is the motto that is found on the MAV, the organisation that I work for, and our crest and our heraldry that was awarded by the King, I think in 1921. The MAV is the legislated peak body that serves the local government sector in Victoria. We are we exist in every state in slightly different formats. And we are here to serve the public good. And I just tacked on the innovation at the front of that for the new innovation lab. And as a kind of guide, or it's not quite a seat on a board, but something that we consistently hold in our decision making is how are we delivering value into our community in a really tangible way at all times. Local government's very tactical and practical. You need to deliver on the ground quickly, and so it's a good reminder for us. The second one, first we shape our tools, then our tools shape us, is from a media theorist, Marshall McLuhan. He's actually riffing on a quote from Winston Churchill from a speech he gave standing in the rubble of London during the Blitz in the Second World War, where he says, "First we shape our buildings, thereafter they shape us." And it's speaking to feedback loops, and and I think maybe a very nice tie into Deb's speech this morning about how the things that we build then go to influence our behaviour, and how our behaviour then continues to influence the things that we build. And both in our tools, and in the case of McLuhan, he's talking about our media environment. Back then it was about television. I think we can all see how the more recent advances in our communications has shaped us culturally and individually. I think the same can also be said for our institutions. And so I work embedded in local government. And I think it was Deb, or maybe Seb, right at the beginning that said, you know, our faith in and trust in institutions is in decline globally. What's really interesting is that in Australia, consistently, surveys reveal that people's belief, faith and trust in local government has actually increased during that time. And I don't have reasons why, but my guess, hopefully an informed guess, would be because of that really practical delivery that local governments are responsible for. There are services and infrastructure that you interact with every single day in every aspects of your life that are under the custodianship of local government. And so there's a really practical and porous nature to local government, which makes it a very challenging domain. The pressures for our councillors and our bureaucrats at a local level is just increasing significantly. But it also is an incredibly rich space for innovation when you have so many different avenues for intervention, and increasingly kind of these touch points for supporting resilience in community.
So for local governments in particular, I imagine having that flexibility is really important. And one of the questions we had posed the other day was, what's a flexible governance structure look like, and how does that work in an organisation? How do we make an organisation nimble and flexible to change? So
we do not have enough time to cover that in the remaining 23 minutes of this session. But what I can talk about is the MAV Lab, the group that I am leading. We serve all 79 councils in Victoria. And the way I look at it, and again, I think this kind of picks up on some of the themes of Deb's talk this morning, we have this sort of sense of a kind of macro scale of a state level of governance and intervention. We have the kind of individual council level, a kind of, we'll call it a micro scale, and in between there is a meso scale, a kind of in-between space that could be kind of a group or a clustering of organisations, or in fact all 79 councils working together collectively as a networked infrastructure. They have a huge amount of power and value as a kind of networked group, and that's where I get really excited. And so the work that we do is looking very much at shared challenges. So what are some of the issues that many of these organisations share, and how might we find ways to collaborate across municipalities and bring together the incredible skills and resources that sit within multiple local governments to find solutions that can then be replicated and scaled, but at a lower cost. And so we're always looking for efficiency, but trying to find ways to use that power of an incredible network to do good work faster.
I think that's such an incredible model that other states could and should be looking at, because you're getting that economies of scale in that. But as we've seen, local governments, when there's budget cuts, the arts is always the first to get attacked. I'm not generalising there, but I think that's just amazing, because if you've got that overarching economies of scale and efficiencies there, nobody gets left behind. So I think well done. That's amazing.
And what we're seeing is that some organisations will have they'll have some amazing people working in a particular area with skills and experience and drive and motivation to push one issue forward that may not be a priority in other areas. But if we can harness the kind of skills and knowledge and try and find ways to document process
Best
and
practice.
then share it, it makes it much easier for other groups to replicate if they don't have that kind of core skill set or often individual in their own organisation. There's a few people in the room the first thing we did was set up a group called the MIAs, the MavLab Innovation Associates Network. We put a call out to everyone in Victorian local government to see if they wanted to join an innovation community of practice. And that has I think we've got about 150 people in it, representing about 60% of councils now. And it's just, and we're co-designing what that group is together, but really focusing on how we kind of invest in those people and their capacity to do this work, even if we're not here in kind of the medium term.
And one of the key things, listening to what you're saying, is about how we enhance that community involvement in decision-making processes, like in all of this work. So we'd love to hear people's thoughts on that as well. Yeah. Yep.
I think it underlies what I said earlier about the streets and so on. If we're explicit about the fact that these are publicly owned or public goods or common goods one way or another, then all of the working around participation suggests that has to be a genuine transfer of control, actually, and or at least going beyond co-design, meaningful participation, co-ownership, cooperative structures, things like that. And the closer you can get to that, then it's when you get very positive, meaningful participation from both sides, genuinely symbiotic. But if it's kind of short of that, it can feel a bit tokenistic or, consultation. How do you like my new freeway?
Yeah.
Yes or no, but it's actually going to be yes. But so that's been a lot of the tradition here and elsewhere. So I think the work that Bonnie's doing is fantastic because it's pushing directly into that area. Then we need to follow through in proper resources at the local level. As we know, it's like Australia, local government is massively under-resourced compared to any kind of global comparison, really. Only the UK, which you nicked the model from, is in equivalent position. Pretty much most European countries, you pay your income tax locally to the city. They deliver health, education, housing, planning, like really big services, and therefore you get massive trust because, it's an equality service in return. So it's a symbiotic relationship again. If it's just rates, rubbish, and roads, that's kind of pretty low stakes. So what you're doing, which I think is great, is lifting the sights on that whole sector and saying this is about our meaningful civic relationship and our shared future. So could not be more important. But we've got to follow through there kind of constitutionally, in terms of resourcing and all kinds of things. And maybe the last example I'd suggest alongside all the Euro stuff is in Japan right now. There's some interesting stuff happening because of the population slowdown and demographic shifts, which are happening everywhere globally. And will be happening everywhere globally within 20 years, but are happening everywhere globally in most places already. And Japan's kind of in the front line of that. And so you're beginning to see villages, down to 50 people or 20 people, and they're coalescing around what they call regional management organizations, or it sounds a lot better in Japanese. But it's essentially what you described. And if we club together, actually we can have a village of 50 people here, and 150 and 50 there, and 2,000 there, because we then start pooling our resources across the whole thing and working together at that scale. And so it's super interesting because it's kind of, they're finding a kind of slow down way of working, which is in this next economy or next society, and it's intensely based on collaboration and participation and meaningful relationships with each other.
Can I bring another angle to it, which is like more technology angle, because I'm kind of interested in how technology can be localized. And that relates to kind of, technological infrastructures and the governance of those as well, potentially. We're developing some like eco-social prototypes, or that's what I'm thinking of them as currently. And one of them is a compost-powered server, which will be located at a permaculture growing site in Manchester. We'll have a compost-powered bio battery there. I don't think this, at this stage, is genuinely a co-design project. We have a collaboration with UAL, as in a community co-design project, and artists who are working on, about to start working with us on this. But what I would be interested in doing is, A, other prototypes, and B, looking at the possibilities for like, definitely what we want to do is work with the growers on these sites and get them to understand the possibilities that they can have to drive their own networks and have kind of their own sovereignty over that, and to be using their tools also for the cultural sector, potentially, if this compost-powered server did, prove to be a useful thing that wasn't doing any damage to the compost, doing its thing, then, there's potential to think about local scaling of these kind of things as well. So it's just an area of interest, which I do think is connected to questions of governance. And you've also got the whole blockchain world, the promise that was there around that as well. But that's...
We could do a whole session on that.
Yeah, that's another conversation.
I guess. I mean, I work for the Federal Arts Agency and we're talking about local government. And I said I wouldn't talk about my personal kind of research, but this is actually something I'm really passionate about. It was like my PhD was on China, like artists in China during that period of intense urban transformation and flux, and how the artists worked with space in a kind of mutually constitutive way to redefine their identity as artists, which was possible in the built environment. And it was most possible at the local government level, because at this time of like intense, still, but that's how politics and power works in China. It's very centralized in Beijing. But even in Beijing, which was where I was living and doing this work, at the local government level, people were negotiating with the local government kind of officials and like, do you mind if I build a house here? Like, Ai Weiwei built all of these illegal buildings, but it was kind of like legal, sort of under the radar, and all these Europeans moved in and then they got demolished, and overseas everyone thought, they're repressing the artists, but it wasn't that. It was actually a kind of housing thing, and like that it was done without permission. But all these things were possible for a little while at that local government level. And so I find that really fascinating, and I take that interest still to Australia and agree, Dan, like the necessary collaboration that has to occur at that local government level for cultural strategies to be implemented. Like, you've got to talk to the traffic people, and you've got to talk to the housing people, and you've got to talk to all the kind of compliance, public transport. We talk about this in federal government as cross-portfolio collaboration, but at that local government level, it's just really grassroots, day-to-day, quotidian, can we get this done? And I think it's really exciting. I guess it is also where a lot of funding for community arts occurs. So federal agency, we fund community arts and cultural development, but we also know when you look at who also funds that, local government rates really, really high. And back to the scoping study, it came through in the consultation with the arts sector as a priority is to do that kind of community engagement and ensure that we're developing new audiences and new workforces and a new kind of understanding of the importance of cultural practice through local government and community engagement at that level.
The note I'd like to pick up on there is the kind of that intense cross-sector collaboration or cross-department, cross-team, the negotiations that have to happen to get things done. And when we worked together about 15 years ago, one of the things that came out of that work when we were doing strategy on the smart cities work at the City of Melbourne, and I think this may have come out of your book as well, but that idea of roles that were distinct from content and process, and people in this kind of acknowledgement that in a increasingly complex decision-making environment that requires this sort of cultivation of a wide range of input and consensus building, you actually need to divorce those roles because it's impossible for one person to hold them. And I ended up getting quite sick after trying to do that for a long time, which is where my stress research took off. But it didn't get up.
It's not my fault.
No, it's definitely not your fault. No, but I often go back to that some of that thinking, and I'll call out my colleagues at RMIT because I think you guys have actually done it, and I'm going to screw up the name of the roles, but Naomi, you're in the audience, and I think the role that you and Matt and others play is an incredible example of very senior, well-respected individuals in that organisation that have stepped out of content roles into this kind of incredible network massaging position where you just make stuff happen. And it's kind of magic. And I haven't seen any other organisation replicate that yet, but I imagine once they find out what you're doing, they will, because I expect that it is delivering really exciting results just from my own personal experience of interacting with it. And I think solving for some of those crunch points that people find when they get stuck in those roles of kind of having to do the content, but then also holding these kind of big spaces of input and relationships.
I think, I mean, that's really interesting, the emerging capabilities role at RMIT. They're moving across the piece and coming back to local government is what we don't really allow to have happen at the moment, various reasons why, political, economic, whatever. But again, we did some work in Shepperton in the last couple of years around housing there, and Shep in north of Victoria, is facing an unbelievable set of challenges, probably from a climate point of view, alongside Lismore, the most at threat in Australia in terms of flooding. And the Climate Council worked out that something akin to 90% of the properties may be uninsurable by 2030 in Shepperton. And you have two council planners in Shepperton Council, one who's doing basically home extension applications every day, and the other one, Colin, is looking at the strategic plan for everything. And it's just like one person who's a planner cannot take this on. I mean, so this is where we need this kind of multifaceted, very diverse teams that can come in and tackle, because this is to do with how we understand housing, how we understand water systems, what we do with agricultural land. It's massive, and it's coming down to Colin from planning. But so
thank you
from
Colin.
account,
who is great, to be clear. It's like, thank goodness.
That sounds like a big job.
He's diligent, but still. The more interesting maybe possibility emerging there is actually the Golden Murray Regional Prosperity Plan, which was written by Uncle Paul, the Yorta leader. And that is a fantastic piece of strategy, working more at the scale of almost the watershed, because from Yorta, who are the first peoples there, that was, of course, the way you would organise a governance question. And that enables you to put multiple things on the table and talk about a much richer idea. It's called prosperity. It's shared prosperity, not really just financial value or something. It's a much bigger set of possibilities. So places like Shep this is why it's so interesting, your role. This is absolutely where these things are playing out every day at the moment.
Yeah, great scale. I'm just very conscious of our time, and I can't believe that we've been almost speaking for an hour, and we do want to throw quickly to some questions from the audience. But I quickly we have just sort of touched on this, which is about the essential skills for future board members. And I'd love to just briefly hear, considering what we've just been talking about and the change of governance that we kind of foresee, does the panel think that the essential future skills might be looking forward?
I think a key bit is, and it's an issue amongst the creative industry, is that there's not a lot of people on boards with creative experience. So I think first up, acknowledging that and being a little bit more deliberate around that diverse thinking that I was mentioning before. If I use my SACSA board as an example, we have very experienced board and business leaders on there, but they actually represent all the industries. that we work for. And the same with my motorsports board. They've all got, some work for KPMG and some, they've all got amazing skills, but they're also industry experienced as well too. So I think that probably is a key thing to be bringing people up through the sector as a start. But I did write a couple of these down because I think as far as developing the board, definitely they will need skills in sustainability. They will need regulatory information. They will need to know more about the circular economy and also around carbon impact. And that comes down to that measuring, once again. So those skills will need to be taught. But more than anything, governance skills. The role of a director. So it doesn't matter how big the organisation is that the board is, you still have the same Corporations Act requirements on you that BHP does. So I think that's a critical thing, that just because it's a not-for-profit or an arts, and it often gets put like that to around board roles, cut your teeth on an arts board. It's not about cutting teeth. This is about making sure that we're putting a skills-based board on that know what they're doing, have got the understand their director's responsibility, but more so that they have industry experience.
Yeah. Exactly.
Yeah, this is an area of strategic focus for Creative Australia, is developing these governance skills for boards in the arts sector. And the first priority, or the one of two, no hierarchy, is just to develop core governance skills. A lot of people in the arts sector lack that formal governance training, and financial literacy is an issue there too. And then the second priority is to ensure accessibility, diversity and access to boards for people who are not properly represented at the moment. And so that includes First Nations people, people from culturally and linguistically diverse backgrounds, people who are deaf or have a disability, people from regional and remote areas, as well as young people. And young people is a really important point there, because there's a pipeline issue there. We need to have the next generation. So there's a governance hub on the website which has a whole lot of resources that address those two needs. And we also have a program which over the last 2 financial years has had about 170 arts workers do training with the Australian Institute of Company Directors.
Awesome.
With a focus on a focus on those identified groups, ensuring that they have access to that training.
Great. Lucy, we're circling back to nature on boards, what do you see as some really essential skills? Before we throw to the questions, what do you think people are going to be needing?
Well, the way we're thinking about it at the moment is that kind of interim proxy model will probably have someone with an ecological focus, but that we are thinking about, do they need a kind of advisory group that has tech expertise from a range of different angles to draw on as well. And all of the above. We've currently paused all recruitment on the board. We actually need to do some recruitment because we want to see, how we go in this process first before we kind of, because we think that's going to change the kind of people we need. So I'll know more about the answer to that question in a few months' time, I think. But also just to say as well, I think we're open to eventually not having a board at all if that is the direction this takes us in.
Wow. Imagine that.
So, a better or worse.
That is
we'll see.
Extraordinary. I love that. I'm going to cross over to the screen over here and do some questions. And I've got the first one on here is talk about when the harmony hits some dissonance, when nature blocks other interests. How does this actually play out politically? Do we have any examples yet of this? Anybody?
I say this happens every day in urban design, architecture, urban planning, landscape architecture, all of those things when they come down to these trade-off decisions. So the Swedish streets example, we did have pretty strong arguments with some people in the streets about taking car parking away, as you might imagine. But when given the choice, people did, because they actually preferred, well, if we could have a tree there instead, if we could have a seat or some bike stands or whatever, or a sand pit, it was genuinely open. It was played out in that way. We gave them the kit of parts, almost like a Lego or IKEA kit for making a street with, and they made the street themselves. And so it happens through negotiation. So that's political with a small p, if you like, as in just decision making at the scale of the street scale and then neighbourhood scale and so on. But we had people from all 3 tiers of government as part of the program as well, so they could then learn from that and absorb that into then, let's say, slower formal processes. And that's where I think, this nature on the board thing gets so interesting, because if you start thinking about our battles over mundane things like bike lanes, which are mundane and also very important, if we're asking car drivers to vote for bike lanes, which is currently what we're doing because we created car dependency at such big scale, it's very hard to get bike lanes out as the answer, relentlessly asking that question. If nature had a vote, you would get bike lanes in a nanosecond,
Yeah.
And so we don't really have a way of incorporating those other systems into the decision making. So it's, that's where we need to get to, and at the moment we do it in a quite sort of awkward way using current processes, but we're heading in that direction, more participative ideally, globally I mean, and with more natural involvement, not less.
Yeah, fantastic. We've got another question here. How do we ensure that this model isn't greenwashing and that the proxy doesn't take advantage of the position? I think it's a
really good question. So I just picked that up initially anyway. The greenwashing is definitely happening. I think actually Lawyers for Nature will be in a much better position to answer this question than I am, because they're seeing that happening on a regular basis, of people coming to them and saying, trying to find out what's the minimum they could do to kind of tick the box, but actually not really have any of that transformational change kind of being embedded into the organisation. So that is something to be aware of, and one of the reasons why they want to be working with us in what we're doing. And I think maybe if you're, I can't speak for people who are working on more kind of corporate levels, but I think that's where kind of questions of transparency and reporting probably come in quite strongly on that side of things with the greenwashing. And then I think there's also, how you embed those protocols across the organisation. So it's not just about the board, but it's about everyone in the organisation. And the different ways that you build that in to decision making is important there. And then there's the other part about that question, which I can't find it now. Where's it gone? There was another part to it about the proxy.
Proxy taking advantage.
Yes, that's a really good question as well. And so you can think about revolving. Proxy is not the ideal. I think we would like, but for us it is an interim model. But you can have more than one proxy. You could have a group, and again, I think it's about the kind of rules that you set up around the proxy and how that works. But that's definitely a consideration.
Yeah, thank you very much. I'm so sorry, but we could literally talk about this for another hour. Can I please get a round of applause for our panel? Thank you so much. Thank you for the question, T.